Our first topic of the day is environment variables. So environment variables are something I consider boring but important. And one of the things that we want to do in this class as programmers is develop independence, right? We want to be able to do all the things programmers can do. And sometimes that means that we're going to have to study things like this that, while not necessarily super exciting, we do need to know. So let's start by giving some motivation for why these are ever going to come up today. Um, Java classes, right? So we know they could be dependent on other classes. For example, in last lecture, we wrote dogs, and dogs implemented are comparable. We could write a test maximizer class that makes sure that the maximizer class works appropriately, and it might use the maximizer class, the dog class, as well as this JUnit class called org.junit.assert, right? No surprises. We just, of course, classes may implement, extend, or just use other classes, okay? So what that means from the perspective of the compiler and the interpreter, if we want to actually compile, say, dog.java, it's very important that our compiler know where its dependencies are, because that way the compiler can actually check and make sure we're obeying type rules and so forth. And just like the compiler, the interpreter needs to know the same. In order for dog.class to run, well, we need our comparable. We have to know where that is so that we can execute anything that might be inside of our comparable. Okay. So how does Java know? Well, at the beginning of the semester, that is, how does it know where things are? So at the beginning of the semester, we had you do a bunch of mysterious computer setup stuff, right? We had you set up IntelliJ, all that. And so the question that comes up here is, when you try and run a program, whenever you try and say Java C dog.java, how does the Java compiler actually know where to find things? Does it look at everything on your computer? What do you think? And let's just say command line here. Okay. So it turns out it is this thing. That step from one of our lab B, I think 2B, 3B, I actually don't remember. So you had to go through and set up your environment or system variable. So Windows, you had to use this ugly little box to set up some variables. And Mac OS or Linux, you edited this bash RC. But in both cases, we said you are creating environment variables. Okay, so what are they? All right. These things, what you're setting up here, this is how Java somehow knows where to find things. We'll go through this in more detail. But let's just say, what is an environment variable in general? Well, every program that's running on your computer has access to the system's environment variables. Okay, so Windows, Mac OS, Linux, all of those, there's basically a big chunk of information that any running program has access to. So environment variables are always strings, so there's no like integers or whatever. And every terminal window has its own set of environment variables, its own copies. So examples from a terminal window on my computer, I might have ClassPath equals this whole string. I might have my log name as Jug. I guess is my login on, I think, this computer. I have here the PWD, which is the present working directory, and this changes anytime you change directories, and so forth. There's many, 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 many such variables, okay? And so the Java compiler interpreter, well, they're programs, right? They're just programs like any other program. There's nothing magic about them. And so, of course, they have access to those variables, because I said every program has them. So indeed, they're going to be using this. So how? Okay, let's see a little example. So on my computer, my class path is :home/home/jug/da-da-da-da/star::dot/ Okay, so there's a way to interpret this string, and in particular, the Java compiler and interpreter assume that there is some environment variable called ClassPath, which it'll grab, and then it'll look at that string and it'll treat these like a bunch of folders and look for dependencies. So in Linux and Mac OS, the paths are separated by colon. So you can think of these as like commas or something. They're separating all the different folders. So I have the empty folder, I have this folder, and I have /. And in Windows, for some reason, paths are separated by semicolons. I guess that's just something Bill Gates or somebody decided back in the day. So we live with it. But most everybody uses colons. Okay. So with ClassPaths, with this particular class path here, what'll happen then is that Java and Java C will basically call, if you know Python, it'll be like .split:, the equivalent of that. So it'll split it into a bunch of items, and it'll first, or it'll look in one of two places. It'll look in home, jug, course material, spring 16, Java lib, and it will also look in /. So for those of you who don't know Linux quite as well, /, by the way, means the current directory. // means one directory up. And the star here, that you'll notice this into this folder, that means don't just look at the .class files in that folder, but also look inside of any .jar file, which is basically just a zip file of class files, but that's not super important right now. What is important right now is that your class path is a list of folders to look at for dependencies. Okay? So let's think about things from the perspective of the interpreter. Just look at an example. Okay? So in this example, this little log of some terminal activity, I say echo class path. Okay? So in my operating system, echo happens to be how you print out something. So I say echo class path, and on the next line it prints it out. In this case, :user/jug, yada, yada, yada. Right? So that's the first thing I did. And then the second command I did was java envmap. So this is invoking, of course, the Java interpreter. And at that point, if we look carefully at what's happening with Java, it is a program that takes a command line argument right here, called it is envmap. Okay, that's the command line argument that says what to execute. And then Java says, okay, well, to run envmap, I need to know where to look for things. So it looks at this class path variable that it has access to, and it will look in the two folders given here, // which is the current folder, and this folder. And it will use that to find envmap and any of its dependencies. So suppose envmap is not in one of these two folders, the current folder or this one, it will say class not found, but in this case it seems fine. And in this case, what does envmap do? Well, it's a little meta, but what it does is print out all of your environment variables. So in this case, there are some, and continues down there. Okay, so that's a world according to the interpreter, how the class path is used. Okay, so here's a question for you to ponder. So of course, as online students, just pause and think a little bit, but let's suppose now that we have a situation where my class path is /weirdDog and /. Okay, and let's suppose further that we're running this code from the folder ~work lecture code spring 16 like 12 examples, and that there is a copy of dog in the current folder, this one, and there's also one in a subdirectory called weirdDog. Okay, so what I want you to do is think about this and say, if we run this command with the class path shown, what do you think happens? And I actually haven't told you enough to resolve the question, but I want you to formulate a hypothesis. First understand the question, and then come up with a hypothesis. Okay, so pause me. Okay, so I shall continue. So let's try it out, actually. So if we go into the setup here, if I echo class path, I currently have weirdDog, and I'm in the weirdDog folder. So if I'm in this folder here, and I try and run dog, it's going to try and find dog.class in the current folder, but there's also one in this weirdDog folder. Okay, so when I run it, it turns out that rather than crashing or anything else, I get the weirdDog. Weird Frank is a dog with 5 fingers. Blah, right? So if we look at the two dogs here, this is the version in the examples folder, and this is the version in the examples weirdDog folder. Okay, so yeah, they have fingers. Okay, so what's going on here? Why did it happen that way? Well, the way that Java resolves this, if it finds two classes that have the exact same name, rather than yell at you and say, uh-oh, there's a duplicate, it'll scan the class path in the order given, and it'll run the first one that it finds. Okay, so if it happens to find one in weirdDog first, that's the one that gets run. That's different than IntelliJ. So if you've used IntelliJ, you know that if you have multiple classes with the same name, IntelliJ will yell at you because it says, well, this is very dangerous. How do I know which one you want? And so if you ran into this issue with Project 1 where we had multiple copies of standard draw, you know what I'm talking about. Okay. But Java, the command line version of Java, does not do that check, and it will just pick the first thing in the class path. So suppose you don't want to use the environment variable given to you by the operating system for some reason. You can instead specify the class path. All right, using the command line argument -cp. So for example, you could say java c space -cp, and then here specify the class path you actually want to use. Okay, so it's just a way of giving the class path as a as a command line argument instead of an environment variable. So let's walk through what this example would do. Because I said -cp, all of this stuff, then whenever we try and compile moo.java, we ignore the operating system provided class path environment variable, and instead we look in the current directory, then home, horse, stuff, and then one directory up for any of moo.java's dependencies. As with the class path variable, though, so just as it was if we use the environment variable, if it so happens that any of moo.java's dependencies have duplicates, then they're going to be resolved in the order of the class path. So first it'll look in current directory, then horse, then one directory up. Okay. And just as an aside, if you happen to be using an IntelliJ, the ClassPath environment variable that we have is just irrelevant, right? Whatever the operating system gives you doesn't matter. IntelliJ will instead, it'll automatically call JavaC and Java with the appropriate CP argument. How does it know what to do? How does IntelliJ know? Well, it just looks at whatever libraries you specified, because when you import a project, you click all those things over and over and over. That's going to make a list of every single library folder. And then anytime you try and compile or run, it transforms that list into a string suitable for -cp. And so if you're running IntelliJ and you want to know what your class path actually is, the thing that's passed along, you can use this right here. But I'm not going to talk about it in lecture. Let's finish off this little bit about class paths with a little puzzle. So let's suppose you submit this code to Gradescope, or submit this stuff to Gradescope. You submit arraydeck.java and ag-test-arraydeck.class. Okay? Suppose further that the autograder is configured with this class path shown here, that the autograder is run using the command java autograder from a folder which contains all the files you submitted, that all files created by the staff are placed in this folder, and finally that autograder.class makes calls to this class right here. The puzzle for you is what happens whenever we do java autograder. Okay? And let's suppose that Java autograder is the top level grading script. It coordinates all of the action, make sure your files compile, all that stuff, and then ultimately reports the results to Gradescope. Okay? So think about that a little bit. Okay, so the interesting issue here is that when Java autograder runs, well, one of its dependencies is ag-test-array-deck. And actually, in this case, there will be two copies. One in this folder, and one also in the current folder, because the student submitted this class file, and it gets placed in, so when the code is run, the current directory is going to contain that file, okay, as well as arraydeck.java. So in this case, what you could do is submit a class file that just reports all tests passed or whatever, and then you get all your points, and it doesn't really matter what arraydeck.java is, I guess, as long as it compiles. So the current version of the grader does not have this vulnerability, by the way. But I do believe that at Princeton at some point we did have this bug, and I don't think anybody ever exploited it, but yeah, kind of interesting. So class paths can be a little tricky, and as I mentioned, boring, but important.